Well, coming back to the business of the day. I trust that you're refreshed, you've had a glass of water, enjoyed your lunch, but as they say in Afrikaans, mag is voor, och is toe. That's not what we're looking for here today. We look to keep you engaged, and by doing so, we'll commence with the first keynote speaker of the day to give us some insight in terms of addressing the lessons for business and development communities from COVID-19. She's a well-respected voice that represents business across sectors of society, and most importantly has been very vocal about the imminent changes that we do need to address within South Africa's business community. Busisiwe Mavuso is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. The inspiring chief executive is going to talk us through the responses that we've seen to COVID-19 and how it is that business and social society can work together to building back better. Let's take a look at this conversation and participate in Q&A following that with Busisiwe Mavuso of Business Leadership South Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me first and foremost start by thanking Trilogue for the invitation for me to come and share my views during its 13th annual Business in Society conference, where I have been requested to share my observations on lessons for the business and development communities on COVID-19. Let's maybe start by acknowledging that we are having this conversation during a critical time when we, as the world, are confronted with what we last saw in the late 30s during the Great Depression. We have been thrown one of the most wicked curveballs in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what makes it more wicked in our case is that it finds us at our weakest as a country. Most of you will remember that the economic outlook for 2020 was already bleak at the beginning of the year, with a projected 0.3% economic growth. At the beginning of this month, we posted very bleak unemployment data, where we recorded 2.2 million jobs lost in the second quarter of the year. This after the shocking Q2 annualized 51% negative economic growth that we posted in September. So in approximately just 7 months, COVID-19 has unraveled much of the progress made over the last 25 years and has exacerbated the weaknesses of the last 10 years. You see, for me, one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has exposed is just how fractured our democracy is and just how unequal we are as a society. A lot of you would remember that there was an interesting text that was doing the rounds at the beginning of the lockdown from an Indian doctor, and he said this in the context of India, but it absolutely resonated in the South African context. He was referring to just how the ways to prevent the virus seem to be accessible to the affluent. He was talking about how we are constantly told to wash our hands, which assumes that you have running water. And we know that in the South African context, that is a luxury that many of our people don't have. We are told that we need to constantly sanitize our hands, which assumes that you have the money to buy the sanitizer in the first place. And yet we know that a lot of our people are still struggling with satisfying their basic and security needs according to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We were told to stay at home, which assumes that you can afford to do so when we know that the majority of our people are unemployed and that a lot of them are employed in the informal sector, meaning that they make their living on a day-to-day basis. We were told that we needed to social distance, which assumes that you have a privilege of living in a house big enough to can actually do so, when we know that a lot of our people live on top of each other, which is why the lockdown was ineffective in townships. You know, if this pandemic doesn't make us as leaders to carefully think about how we sustainably start to deal with our structural economic flaws, then I don't know what will. You see, countries that will bounce back quickly from this crisis are those with a diamond economic structure, with an 80% middle class, because it is the middle class that carries the economies, not the rich. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about the lessons that we have observed for the business and the development communities from the COVID-19 crisis. What is it that we as business and development communities ought to be focusing on as lessons that we have observed from this COVID-19 crisis? You know, the biggest ticking time bomb that we have in this country is inequality. And the problem about domestic inequality is that it undermines social stability, which means the quest of attaining a sustainable and conducive environment within which business should operate will continue to be elusive. And it is for this reason that as business, we need to be more intentional and deliberate about the role we play in society. And this is the reason why I like this theme that we are discussing today of the role business ought to play in society. At this point, let me just acknowledge the critical role we have played as business in lessening the COVID-19 crisis blow and in keeping South Africa moving forward, and what we have done as business in powering our nation's progress. So business has done a lot, from assisting with the delivery and collection of medical equipment and food parcels, the procurement of PPE for our frontline medical heroes, and the more important task of setting up the Solidarity Fund and the billions that we have invested in that fund. So the question we need to be asking ourselves is what now and where to from here? And more importantly, what is required from each of the social partners in moving the country forward? All of our efforts need to be geared towards economic recovery, and what the country needs right now is rational, pragmatic choices to guide our actions, and it is going to be of paramount importance that we prioritize ruthlessly when it comes to our priorities as a country. We need to deploy our energies on interventions that will move us forward. So from a government perspective, let's acknowledge that government controls the policy environment that we must all work within. So we need government to come up with a president-led and cabinet-backed plan that we can all get behind with a common vision. The network partners have done their part in this regard, and we have presented to the president our proposed economic recovery strategy, and what is required now is a pronouncement in this regard, as well as a clear and decisive leadership from the top. From a labor perspective, you know, I have heard arguments that our stringent labor regulations don't contribute to unemployment. And I must say that I actually find the argument laughable. It is unarguable that the higher the cost of an input in production, the less of it will be required and the less of it will be used, especially when there are substitutes. And let's agree that there are substitutes for labor. And those substitutes are where businesses choose. Because of the stringent labor regulations, businesses will often choose to work with fewer people and give them more machines to increase their productivity. You know, I have heard arguments that our stringent labor regulations don't contribute to unemployment, and I must say that I find the argument laughable. It is unarguable that the higher the cost of an input in production, the less of it will be used, especially when there are substitutes. And there are substitutes for labor. You decide to work with fewer people as business, and you tend to work with more machines to increase your productivity. The figures that we have seen show that this has clearly been happening over the last few decades. And I'm not talking about wages here. Those are certainly part of the cost, but not the only part. A great deal of cost is created by regulation. employers spend a great deal on labor disputes that end up in the CCMA or in court. A lot of production is lost to strikes. Many employers sit with unproductive or even destructive staff members because it is too difficult to fire them. With millions of people unemployed, our labor regulation is incredibly biased towards the already employed. An economy that is able to quickly replace unproductive workers at minimal cost will be one that employs many more workers, both because on an average they will be more productive and because the all-in cost of hiring them would be lower. That's even while the wages are high. So let's agree that as a country, we seem to lack the political courage to address some of the stringent labor regulations and to have an honest and a frank discussion with our labor constituency in this regard. So I think it is about time that labor came to the party by working with business to preserve and create more jobs. I think there needs to be serious consideration around short time and the amendment of some of the rigid labor regulations, even if it is just to save one job. And I think if we can achieve that, that should definitely be the focus. Actually, if you look at it, you will see that the investment of business in society is self-serving for us as a business constituency, because by investing in society, you are actually investing in the future markets and in your sustainability. Because given the environment that we find ourselves in as a country, where we have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape, you will see and understand that if business were to be deliberate and intentional about investing in society, then you can create an environment where we change the structure of our economy from that of a pyramid shape to that of a diamond shape. And we can therefore end up with the result of having more people employed and more people with disposable income. And if you have more people with disposable income, you have more people who can now afford your goods and services. And if more people can afford your goods and services, then demand increases for businesses. And if demand increases, then we can produce more. And if we can produce more, then we can hire more people. And if we can hire more people, then unemployment decreases. And if unemployment decreases, then there are more people that are contributing to the tax revenue. And if there are more people contributing to the tax revenues, then you have a more stronger fiscus, and you have a country and a government that can do more from a fiscal perspective. I don't think I need to spell this even further. I'm talking about economics 101. So for my business colleagues in the room, let's get this straight. South Africa's social injustice is businesses' crisis as much as it is government's crisis. It is our crisis because as a grouping that has levers to economic power, we have a special responsibility to work firmly towards this agenda. And let's agree as business that some things are bigger than self-interest and some things are bigger than the profit motive. And those are issues of national interest. And these need to be elevated above all. And it cannot just be left to government to fix our structural inequalities as a country. Because unfortunately for us, government's failure is South Africa's failure. And South Africa's failure is business's failure. And as the adage goes, show me a failed state and I'll show you a failed nation. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your indulgence. And I look forward to having this conversation and to having further indulgence on this issue. Thank you.
Busisiwe Mavuso, the Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa there, sharing some very strong words and I think agreeing and sharing a reminder with us that the one thing we all agree that we don't want to be is a failed state. We're fully aware of the challenges that we face in South Africa as we are faced with them, not only at the coalface of industry and activities on the ground, but also in common newspaper headlines and interactions that we've witnessed as peers within the business industry. Well, we're going to engage in conversation now with Busisiwe Mavuso, and we welcome you to share your comments and feedback through the platform via the Q&A session and section that you'll note is beneath the video if you're using a much smaller device, and on the side if you're using a laptop. Let's engage in conversation now and pulling out some of the highlights that you've mentioned. Sis Busisiwe, a warm welcome and thank you so much for providing this afternoon's keynote, certainly hitting on many of the right notes that we'd like to expand on. And one particular area of interest that you highlighted was this level of distrust that we see amongst various stakeholders. You alluded to Labour specifically, but I'd like us to expand it slightly to ensure that we incorporate all participants who are engaging with us here today. This trust deficit that you've also publicly been vocal about, how is it that in a time of COVID-19 where, again, self-protection, self-preservation and self-interest appears to have come to the forefront, how do we ensure that we alleviate the pressures of this trust deficit and come to the table once again, not only to communicate, but to truthfully seek opportunities to collaborate as respective stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kuku. So I think we can only achieve that, Kuku, by our actions. And I think if our actions are anything to go by, then we are a long way off from fixing the trust deficit that we're currently facing and that currently exists between the different social partners. I think we have seen, and our people have found themselves in an environment where they've faced one of the most extreme hardships, due to what has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis and our economy, being in tatters, as it were. And I think in the midst of all of that, we were presented with a 500 billion stimulus package that was meant to alleviate, the adversities that a lot of our people are facing. But I think if you ask a lot of people with regards to the UIF, with regards to the food parcels, with regards to the social grant of unemployment that they were promised, with regards to accessing the loans, from the bank, in as far as the trade guarantee scheme is concerned, with the pay SMMEs in 30 days, that the president was advocating for at the beginning of the year, and a whole lot of those proposed interventions that were actually supposed to assist, alleviate this difficult time that a lot of our people are going through. A lot of them will tell you that they haven't been able to access that, so it becomes difficult, to say, how do we actually move on, and what is it that we have to do to fix the trust deficit that we're currently facing as a country? I think even during this time, we are still seeing the lethargic action, or rather inaction, that we've been seeing from government for quite some time. Even after the Q2 GDP numbers have come out showing a 51% annualized negative growth, the Q2 job stats, coming out showing that we've lost 2.2 million jobs. We still don't have a plan in terms of what is it that we're actually going to do as a country to turn our economic trajectory around. I don't know to what extent do we understand as a country that this economic crisis that we're facing requires a certain degree, of agency that we need to apply the same way that we did, when facing the health crisis at the beginning of this pandemic. We saw government moving with a certain degree of speed. It's 3 weeks later, after the president has been presented by the economic recovery strategy by the social partners, and we are yet to hear from the president in terms of what the marching orders are going to be. We have seen government arguing between themselves with regards to, the politically exposed people's definition, and government and politicians pushing back against what the NPA and the entire justice system is trying to do in terms of reining in corruption. We've seen the president take a hard line in as far as corruption is concerned, and we have seen a very fast retort from our previous president, Jacob Zuma, saying literally back off, So I think these are the actions that are not standing us in good stead as leaders in this country today. And I don't just want to put this on government. I think there's a lot that we can be doing as business as well. Yes, we have set up the Solidarity Fund. Yes, a lot of businesses are trying to do their best in terms of ensuring that laying off people is the last resort. But I really think that business, as the only social partner with disproportionate resources and maybe a disproportionate voice, could actually be doing more in terms of trying to alleviate this poverty that we're currently facing. Because as I said, in my address, that investing in our communities is really investing in ourselves. Because once we have a stable environment, once we can alleviate the social instability that we're actually seeing as a country, then business can definitely prosper. Because it is difficult to see how we can prosper in an environment that is not prosperous.
I'm glad that you refer to it that way and, of course, highlight a wide variety of themes that do need to be focused on. But we've got a question that has come through here on the Q&A, which wants us to put it succinctly onto top 3 elements that we need to focus on. We understand it's collaboration, trust, ensuring that there's investment, ongoing confidence. But the question says there seems to be so much complexity to this issue. What would be your top 3 priorities that we should focus on?
If we're talking about changing the economic trajectory around, let's agree that the environment within which business operates, the environment within which investment ought to be attracted is not there in South Africa at the moment. So let's agree that there is need for structural reform. Let's agree that there is need to ensure that we contribute towards a conducive environment. I think I would say the top 3 issues would definitely be improving the ease of doing business. I think the high regulatory rigidity that we find ourselves in as a country doesn't offer well for attracting investment. I think number 2, which is an issue that Minister Tenel has already addressed or is starting to address, is the clarity in as far as the land reform is concerned. Because there is no investor that is actually going to bring their money and assets in an environment where they are not guaranteed property rights. So unless and until we are clear what the amendment of Section 25 is going to look like, then we can forget about investment. And I think the third issue definitely ought to be, how do we actually deal with the looming fiscal crisis, that we're actually facing as a country. I think the finance minister has spoken about how, in the next 3 years, we are going to be facing a fiscal debt crisis, as it were. So we need to be looking at that and addressing the fiscal debt crisis. Let's agree that as our SOEs, ESCOM in particular, and the clarity around the just energy transition, how we actually need to solve the issue of energy stability. Is key among those. Because again, how are businesses supposed to operate in an environment where we are going to be faced with 12 hours of load shedding? And how is investment supposed to come in an environment where they are going to be faced with load shedding? So I think those are the 3 top issues.
Fair enough that you need an environment that is suitable for growth as well as investment. But business has also not been without its fair share of criticism, Busisiwe. If we take a look at the headlines we witnessed during the extreme levels of lockdown, there was a significant amount of investment freeze and output or holding back from several corporate companies which could have invested in areas where there would be a spin-off on additional social development as well as employment. And this goes back to the analogy that you drew to, the pyramid economy moving to the diamond shape economy. And there's a question here that actually asks, how is it then that businesses still continue to contribute to inequality, given that salaries and bonuses at the top, at an executive level, far outweigh what it is that individuals at an entry level might be earning? How do you address that question as to how we change that shape from a pyramid, inverted pyramid, to one that is a diamond structure?
And it is not just the salary inequalities, it is also, as it is evidenced by the Commission of Employment Equity report that comes out from the Department of Labor year after year, it is just about whose or who occupies the C-suites of the private sector. And the recent reports are telling us that white males, in an environment where the stats are telling us that there are more Black African females entering universities, there is more graduating than the past being absorbed into corporate. But when you look at the C-suite, when you look at the positions of the private, you will see that Black African women, are very few and far in between as well. So, and I think without deflecting the attention from business, my view is that I don't think that we can continue begging business to do the right thing. We've got legislation in place that says business ought to do the right thing, in the form of employment equity and in the form of equity. And if business is failing to do what is right, the way we are, by the way, 26 years into democracy, then legislation should come in. We should actually be dragged, kicking and screaming as business to do the right thing. So I think for me, this is a failure of monitoring and evaluation. This is a failure of government, actually saying to business, you are going to toe the line or else. This is the failure of penalty, being actually ushered in so that business can, you need to keep business where it hurts the most. And I think that is, in as far as profits are concerned. So penalize business 10% of their profit, if they don't continue with this legislation. Because to what end, and how long are we going to have a conversation where we are begging business to do the right thing in terms of bringing the privileged disadvantage in the economic nation? So because we are failing, my view is that, drag us kicking and screaming, hit us where it hurts the most. Ensure that our bottom line and our profits are actually, penalized, so that we can therefore start learning. Because then in this environment, and while we keep on having this conversation, nothing is going to happen.
Very significant pointers that you've highlighted too, and I see the questions are still streaming in terms of how best we implement necessary policy, everything from triple BE and ensuring that compliance does take place. But very briefly, Sis Busisiwe, I think it would only be fair for the audience to get your views in terms of the next few months prove to be quite challenging for South Africa. Everything from the economic recovery plan that's due to be delivered by the president later this week, to the midterm budget policy review from the finance minister, and of course, international reaction from ratings agencies in response to this. Despite the noise in the market, do you and your members have any firm commitment to making things work in South Africa to avoid us being a failed state?
We definitely do have a firm commitment, but I guess business can only do so much, because I guess, as I've said, that we are finding ourselves in an environment where there's going to be a lot of economies like ourselves who are actually going to be competing, in the global capital market, that are actually going to be competing for their fair share of the capital allocation, who are actually going to be competing for the investment that is available in the global, market as it were. So if we fail to adequately position ourselves as the investment destination, and as the gateway to the African continent, then unfortunately, our fate as South Africa is already still. We've already been given another warning shot, by Moody's, saying that you had better get your act together or else there is a further downgrade. I mean, we're already sub-investment grade. So for Moody's to be saying that we are looking at a situation where we could be downgrading further, I don't know what would say us into action, if not correct. So I think what will change, things around is what is going to come out from the president on Thursday evening, as far as, announcing tangible, and time-bound, interventions that we ought to be implementing towards critical structural reforms. And let's hope that the finance minister is actually going to be as brilliant as it is, and let's hope that government will work with him in ensuring that the budget is what it's supposed to be. And let's stop spending on useless things like SAA, and I think the public wage bill, as sensitive an issue as it is, we cannot afford, to actually put a moratorium and a freeze on salary increases in the public sector. We honestly cannot afford it as a country.
Well, we await the outcomes with bated breath. Sis Busisiwe, thank you so much for your time today. Very clear and concise in terms of the shortfalls of various stakeholders in coming to the party, and most importantly, the elements that are required to ensure that there is a concerted effort to prioritize investment from business, which in itself then has a ripple effect in terms of addressing the social divides and inequities that we have here in South Africa. Sis Busisiwe, a big pleasure having you with us, and thank you so much for your time. That was Busisiwe Mavuso. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa, sharing some insights with us in terms of key lessons and learnings that business needs to implement post-COVID-19. Well, these conversations will continue, and hence we have them here on the platform, looking at the feedback from the chat as well as the Q&A session. Lots of questions in terms of structural reform and, of course, the necessary policies that we need to follow up with. And, of course, business also being held to account with some of the losses that they've experienced and halting investment. And, of course, fraud and corruption being a key element that has often come up in previous conversations. So this content will still be available for you if you happen to miss out on the first half of that conversation. As long as you have access to the platform, the video and the content will still be available for the next 6 months.